In the next part of this module, we are going to focus on how the nerve then stimulates the skeletal muscle in order to create a muscle contraction. And we'll take it one step farther and actually figure out how not only do we contract the muscle, but how do we contract it in a certain pattern that produces the amount of force that is needed. For example, how do we tell our muscles that we need to walk instead of run? Or how do we tell our muscles that we need to lift a textbook or that we need to lift a 20-pound dumbbell? So first thing we need to do is break into a motor unit. A motor unit, the definition I have here at the bottom is a single alpha motor neuron and all the muscle fibers that it innervates or stimulates is the definition the book uses. And so simply put, it is a nerve. So we have our nerves coming out of our motor cortex into our spinal cord. We then have a synapse that then sends a alpha motor neuron out of the spinal cord and into the muscle, and it then innervates several muscle fibers. So one point I think that this figure really well represents it, and why I have it in here, this one isn't from your book, it's from a different source, is the idea that these muscle fibers that are innervated by a motor unit aren't actually next to each other, right? So you can clearly see here that we have red dots. These are ones that would be innervated by the muscle fiber, and one, you'll point out that there are lots of them. So motor units are usually one neuron, again, and several muscle fibers. And that muscle fiber number can actually vary quite a bit. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. But so what you can see is these red dots are actually spread apart in the muscle, which makes sense, right? Because if all the muscles were kind of clumped together and we stimulated a motor neuron, then we would kind of get these small pieces of, or very small segments of a muscle all contracting together. Whereas if you spread it out, then you can kind of get, you wouldn't get this one tight little bunching of your muscle and the rest of it look relaxed, right? You can kind of contract the whole muscle together where certain fibers are relaxed and the one right next to it may be contracting so that the whole muscle moves together as opposed to these tiny little pieces. So here is another figure in your book. This kind of just zooms in on the motor unit itself. Again, the same definition applies. So we have one alpha motor neuron that then comes and innervates muscle fibers. This demonstrates that same principle very nicely, right? So that we have these muscle fibers are innervated here, and then this fiber right next to it is innervated by the other alpha motor neuron. So again, I think that is a key principle to think about is muscle cells side by side aren't going to be innervated by the exact same motor unit. And I think one of the nice things that the textbook did, I think they did it on purpose, is the idea that they actually have different colored muscle cells. So if you look, this one is kind of whiter and this one is red. If we'll remember back to last chapter when we talked about muscle fiber types, right? Red usually means a type 2, whereas a whiter muscle fiber, or sorry, red means type 1, whereas a whiter muscle fiber would be a type 2. And so what they really show here is that all muscle fibers innervated by this alpha motor neuron are all red, whereas the 3 muscle fibers innervated by this motor neuron are all white. And so that is very critical, and that is kind of shown here again. So with that, we can break down motor units into categories that have specific properties, right? So as I just showed, we have each of our motor units are only going to innervate one single type of a muscle fiber. So we'll have motor units that innervate only type 1 or slow. We'll have motor units that are specific for innervating type 2A fibers, and we have motor units that are specific for innervating type 2B or X fibers, right? So there's several things that we can talk about this. So one is the size of the motor neuron. I think the book does, or this image that's not from the book, they talk about this in the book a little bit, not great, but I think this image really does it in. It could probably be exaggerated a little bit. So one is the idea that the size of the neuron. So indeed, the neuron size is actually smaller in the slow twitch fibers, and as you get to the type 2B or type 2A and then type 2X, you'll see that this cell body here in the neurons actually are getting larger. Right? So we can say that the size of the neuron, the smaller the size of the neuron, then that is related to a slow twitch fiber. Right? The next is, as we mentioned, fiber type. Only a motor unit will only innervate the exact same fiber type, so we have 3 different specific motor units. Last is third is the number of fibers that are innervated by each motor unit. So this is not depicted on this picture very well, and I couldn't find a great image for this that kind of brought this all together. So just kind of draw along with me if you would. But in general, let me grab my pen here. Let's grab some pinkish for some skeletal muscle. So in general, the number of fibers that each motor unit innervated is going to be dependent also on the fiber type. The lowest number of fibers innervated by a motor unit are going to be seen in the slow. So then we could draw here. So I think this is there we go. Let me draw my striations nice and pretty for you, right? So as we get bigger, the type 2 motor units then are going to innervate more fibers. So in this example here, we'll have 3 muscle fibers innervated by this motor unit, and here this is 5 muscle fibers. I'll go ahead and say this though, those are just made up numbers, and indeed those are actually much larger numbers than these singular things. And then if we look at the type 2B or 2X fibers, right, they will have even more. So in this example here, then the fastest motor unit would actually have a innervate several fibers, so 7 or 8 muscle fibers in that. So again, number of fibers innervated. Slow motor units are going to innervate a small number of fibers. The larger the neuron, the fiber type becomes again fast, and they will be even greater. So here example from 3 to 5, and then to around 7 or 8 in these larger motor units. And what the size of the neuron and these muscle fibers that it innervates ultimately determines is the mean firing rate, or the amount of times that that neuron will fire per minute. The smaller the neuron, the easier it is for that neuron to depolarize. So if you think back to anatomy and physiology, and when they talked about IPSPs and EPSPs and kind of controlling these positive and negative signals at the neuron, and then once it reaches threshold from getting enough excitatory synapses, then it will stimulate a muscle contraction or action potential. So the same thing is going on with the size of the neuron. If you think about it though, it's just easier to get it to threshold than it is this larger neuron and larger cell body. So the mean firing rate is actually much faster in slow motor units and slower in the fast twitch motor units. And so our brain is pretty powerful in taking advantage of this, right? We also talked about earlier in the fiber type lessons that these fibers are have their pros and cons, right? One of the pros is they're really big and they generate lots of force, but the con is that they fatigue rapidly. Whereas the slow twitch muscle fibers, they don't generate near as much force, but they can go for long extended period of times without fatiguing, and our brain uses that ability then to form muscle contractions and to be able to do a workload. So this figure, is again not in your book, but I think a really good one. And this illustrates what we call the size principle of motor unit recruitment. The idea is that motor units are recruited from the smallest to the largest. Smallest meaning smallest neuron, smallest meaning the smallest number of fibers, which again are type 1 fibers. Right? So here, if we look at the fraction of the motor unit pooled, or if we're looking at, and then the amount of force that's being generated, we'll work our way up from essentially 0% of your 1 rep max, or max volitional contraction is the same thing, or all the way up to 100%. So as you can see, in the early on beginning stages, when you're lifting 20 to 25% of your 1 rep max, this is relatively light. It's not a lot of force. You can generate that force selectively by picking out your slow motor units only. Right? This is when that mean firing rate really comes into play, and your book highlights this in a figure that I don't present, but you can kind of read through, and that these slow motor units are faster to fire so that they can generate that force. They're easier to depolarize, easier to get going, and therefore are the first ones to fire. As our brain decides we need to generate more and more force, we will then continue to move on in the size principle and start to recruit the type 2A fibers. Right? As we continue up that and we reach even more force, once we're no longer able to lift that with those units, we will ultimately have to recruit our type 2A muscle fibers. Our type 2B X muscle fibers, and those are what will be the most forceful. You can see the slopes here really goes up, right? This is the amount of force is generated by these is much larger than the slow twitch muscle fibers, which we talked about earlier. And so we recruit those. And from a physiology perspective, this makes perfect sense, right? In order to generate a low amount of force, why would we use our type 2 X fibers, right? If we use those fibers, you're going to get tired really fast. Right? So if you use these slower units that don't fatigue, you're able to generate that force, maintain it for a long time, and you have no worries about fatigue. And so the idea is that your brain is conserving these fast fibers until you have that force is necessary. So again, that's regulating it on the whole level, specifically picking out which motor units are going to be used at the muscle level. If we look then next at how do we kind of regulate this at the single muscle level, is with this slide here. So muscle does follow the all or none principle, stating that once the nerve reaches threshold and sends an action potential down to the muscle, then that muscle is going to contract fully. There's no real graded. It can't do half a muscle contraction. It can't stop and say, oh, just kidding, we didn't need that. But it's going to go through its normal muscle contraction. So the way that this is studied is by using this picture, this is out of your book, is by taking a muscle and kind of putting it in a bath where we can then either stimulate it with the nerve, or we can actually directly stimulate this in the bath, and we can look at the force generated by this muscle by putting a force transducer here at the top and fixing this at the bottom so that it pulls across that and tells us how much force that muscle is generating. So in general, if you send an action potential here, this is dictated by this line here, so motor neuron activity is increased, then we see a muscle contraction. Again, this all or none response is seen here, right? So we get the exact same shape of the curve both times, right? We go from baseline, muscle contraction, back to rest at baseline, then it's stimulated again to contract by an action potential, and we get the exact same all or none curve. However, one of the important factors that we can do as muscle to regulate force kind of at the fiber or at the motor unit level, either way you can think about it, is to kind of stack these muscle contractions on top of each other. So one single muscle fiber contraction is what we consider a twitch. If we add multiple twitches before this next fiber gets to baseline again, right? So we're contracting and then we start to relax, and then another action potential comes in down that motor unit and stimulates the skeletal muscle fiber, then we actually get a larger muscle size or muscle contraction force. And then if we do that again, we'll continue to kind of get higher and higher levels of force. So essentially we're adding this muscle force onto this, and then we're adding this onto this, and that adding is nice when the English language makes sense, and we call that summation, right? So we have our twitch, and then we have the summation or the addition of these muscle twitches onto each other to get an even higher force. And you can see as the rate of action potentials increases, then the rate at which this summation occurs is very rapid until we get action potentials that are stacked so close together that this muscle then plateaus at its force and it maintains that. And we call that is reaching tetany. Right? So this is the maximum amount of force that that muscle fiber can generate. So again, just to kind of sum those two slides up, we can regulate it at the whole muscle level by selecting these motor units and going from the slowest to the fastest. And then we can also regulate at the single fiber level by telling it how many times essentially per second that muscle is going to contract. The more action potentials we send, the faster we send them, the more force will be produced until we reach a tetanic contraction in that muscle fiber, which is then the most force that it can produce. Next up, we're going to cover neural adaptations to exercise to close this module out.